The morning sun streamed through the windows of Riverside High School as Lily wheeled herself through the bustling hallways. The wheels of her chair made a soft whirring sound against the polished floor, a sound she'd grown so familiar with over her 15 years that it had become like background music to her life. As a sophomore with cerebral palsy, Lily had learned to navigate not just the physical challenges of high school, but also the curious glances and awkward smiles that sometimes came her way. "Hey, watch out for that backpack," called out her best friend Maya, quickly moving someone's carelessly dropped bag out of Lily's path. Maya had been by her side since middle school and somehow always managed to spot obstacles before they became problems. Their friendship had started over a shared love of writing fan fiction, and now they were inseparable. Lily's morning routine had become a well-choreographed dance. She arrived 20 minutes early to avoid the main rush of students, giving herself plenty of time to reach her locker and organize her books. Her mom had helped her arrange everything perfectly: textbooks on the bottom shelf, notebooks in the middle, and her favorite pens and supplies in an easy-to-reach container. "Did you finish the creative writing assignment?" Maya asked, falling into step beside Lily's wheelchair as they headed to their first class. "Your story about the time-traveling chef was amazing." Lily grinned, her eyes lighting up. "Thanks, I stayed up late working on it. I really want to get into that summer writing program." Her dreams of becoming a writer weren't just idle fantasies. She'd already won 2 local writing competitions, and her English teacher had recommended her for a prestigious youth author workshop. But as they approached room 204, Lily's smile faded slightly. Biology class with Ms. Kumar was next, and something about the new teacher's behavior made Lily's stomach twist with anxiety. It had started subtly enough. A slight frown when Lily needed extra time to write down notes, an impatient tap of her foot when Lily's wheelchair required some rearrangement of the lab stations. "Deep breath," Maya whispered, giving Lily's shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading to her own class down the hall. "Text me if you need anything." Inside the classroom, Lily carefully maneuvered to her usual spot, thankful that she'd worked out an arrangement with the previous teacher to have a slightly wider space between desks. But today, something was different. New lab equipment had been set up, and the careful spacing she relied on had been disturbed. "Mrs. Kumar?" Lily called out politely as other students began filing in. "I'm having trouble getting to my desk. Could we maybe move this carb a little?" The teacher looked up from her computer, and Lily caught that familiar flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "We have a lot to cover today," Mrs. Kumar replied, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Just sit wherever you can fit. We can't keep rearranging the whole classroom." Heat crept up Lily's neck as she felt her classmates' eyes on her. Next to her, she heard someone whisper, "That's not fair," but nobody spoke up. With careful maneuvering, she managed to find a spot near the back, though it meant she couldn't see the board clearly. As Mrs. Kumar began the lesson on cell division, Lily tried to focus on taking notes, but her hands weren't cooperating well today. Sometimes her muscles tensed unexpectedly, making her handwriting messier than usual. She could type much more easily on her laptop, but Mrs. Kumar had insisted everyone take handwritten notes for better retention. "Keep up, please," Mrs. Kumar called out, her eyes fixing on Lily's struggling hands. "We can't wait for everyone to catch up every time." The words stung, but what hurt more was the subtle emphasis on everyone, as if the entire class was being held back because of one student. Lily's textbook slipped from her desk as she tried to turn the page, falling with a loud thump. As she struggled to reach it, she heard Mrs. Kumar mutter something under her breath. Though she couldn't make out the exact words, the tone was clear enough. A quiet boy named Raj, who sat near her, quickly picked up the book and handed it back with a kind smile. "Here you go," he whispered. "Don't worry about her. My cousin has CP too, and she's studying to be a doctor now." That small act of kindness helped Lily hold back the tears that had been threatening to fall. She remembered what her mom always said, "Your challenges don't define you. They're just part of what makes you uniquely you." And she was right. Lily might need a wheelchair to get around, but that hadn't stopped her from maintaining a 3.8 GPA, writing award-winning stories, or making genuine friends who saw past her disability. The rest of the class passed in a blur of mitosis diagrams and chromosome pairs. Lily did her best to keep up, even though her notes were incomplete. She'd have to ask Maya to share hers later, or maybe look up some educational videos online, something she'd gotten pretty good at doing when classroom instruction fell short. As the bell rang and students began packing up, Mrs. Kumar announced, "Tomorrow we'll be doing our first major lab experiment. Everyone needs to be quick and efficient. We can't have any distractions." Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward Lily. Instead of letting the comment crush her spirit, Lily felt a familiar determination rising in her chest. The same determination that had helped her learn to navigate her wheelchair through crowded malls, that had pushed her to join the school newspaper despite her typing challenges, that had earned her the respect of teachers who'd initially underestimated her. Outside in the hallway, Maya was already waiting. One look at Lily's face told her everything she needed to know. "Rough class?" she asked, falling into step beside her friend. "Yeah," Lily sighed, then managed a small smile. "But you know what? I'm going to ace this class anyway. Mom always says success is the best revenge." "That's my girl." Maya grinned, pulling out her phone. "Hey, want to work on our stories at my house after school? Mom's making those chocolate cookies you love." As they headed to their next class, Lily felt her spirits lifting. One difficult teacher couldn't erase all she'd accomplished or dim her dreams for the future. Tomorrow would be another challenge, but she'd face it like she faced everything else, with determination, dignity, and the support of people who believed in her. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, catching the determination in Lily's eyes as she wheeled toward her next class. She might not be able to control how others treated her, but she could control how she responded. And she chose to respond with grace, strength, and an unwavering belief in herself. As September melted into October, the autumn leaves weren't the only things changing at Riverside High. The supple tension in Mrs. Kumar's biology class had grown into something harder to ignore, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. For Lily, each class had become an exercise in holding her breath, never quite sure when the next uncomfortable moment would arrive. "Today's quiz will be timed," Mrs. Kumar announced one crisp morning, walking between the rows of desks with a stack of papers. 20 minutes, not a second more. Her eyes lingered on Lily for a moment too long, making it clear who this new rule was targeting. Normally, Lily received extended time for written work. It was right there in her accommodation plan. But Mrs. Kumar, a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the room. It was Raj, his usually soft-spoken demeanor carrying an edge of concern. "Doesn't the school policy say?" "School policy," Mrs. Kumar cut him off, "doesn't mean we need to hold back an entire class. The real world doesn't give special treatment." She began distributing the papers, the sharp snap of each quiz hitting the desks, punctuating her words. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a pencil. The questions swam before her eyes as she tried to focus, knowing that her muscles might not cooperate with the rushed timing. Next to her, she could hear the scratching of pencils as other students hurried through their answers. Maya caught her eye from across the room, giving her a supple thumbs up. Just seeing her friend's encouraging face helped Lily take a deep breath and start working. She knew the material, she'd studied for hours, making detailed notes and flashcards. But her body sometimes needed a little extra time to express what her mind knew so well. 15 minutes into the quiz, just as Lily was hitting her stride, Mrs. Kumar's voice rang out. "Time's almost up. 5 minutes left." She walked between the rows, pausing near Lily's desk. We're not even halfway done, are we?" The words were quiet, meant only for Lily's ears, but they carried the weight of public humiliation. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Priya, who sat 2 rows over, actually stopped writing to glance between Lily and the teacher, her expression troubled. But nobody said anything. The silence in the room felt heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the rustle of paper. When Mrs. Kumar collected the quizzes, she made a show of sighing at Lily's incomplete work. "I suppose we'll have to mark this as is." The disappointment in her voice suggested this was exactly what she'd expected. During the following week's lab assignment on plant cells, Mrs. Kumar grouped students into pairs but conveniently ran out of partners before reaching Lily. "Oh dear," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Well, you can observe what the others are doing. Sometimes that's just as good as participating." Lily watched as her classmates carefully prepared slides and adjusted microscopes, her own hands folded uselessly in her lap. She'd been looking forward to this lab for weeks. She'd even practiced handling slides at home with a kit her mom had bought her. The microscope would have been perfectly accessible from her wheelchair height. "Hey," Rage whispered from the next table over. "Why don't you join our group? We can take turns." His lab partner, Priya, nodded enthusiastically, already pulling over an extra chair. But before Lily could wheel over, Mrs. Kumar materialized between the tables. "That won't be necessary. 3 people at a station is too crowded. It's a safety issue." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" The word accidents hung in the air like a threat. Lily felt her cheeks burn as she caught snippets of whispered conversations around the room. Some students were openly staring now, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. Later that day, Maya found Lily in their usual lunch spot behind the library. "This has got to stop," Maya said, pulling out her sandwich with more force than necessary. "What she's doing isn't just mean, it's wrong." Lily poked at her own lunch without much appetite. "Maybe she's right," she said quietly. "Maybe I am slowing everyone down." "Don't you dare," Maya's voice was fierce. "Don't let her make you doubt yourself. You're one of the smartest people I know, and being in a wheelchair doesn't change that. Remember last year's science fair? Your project on adaptive technology won first place." As they talked, more students began drifting over to their usual lunch spot. Raj arrived with his homemade curry, and Priya joined them with her colorful bento box. Neither of them mentioned the incident in class directly, but their presence felt like a silent show of support. "Did you guys see the new movie trailer about that physicist who uses a wheelchair?" Raj asked, carefully steering the conversation toward lighter topics. "They're saying she might win a Nobel Prize next year." The conversation flowed easily after that, but Lily couldn't completely shake the weight of what was happening in biology class. She'd faced prejudice before, the occasional rude comment from strangers, the well-meaning but condescending praise for doing ordinary things. But this was different. This was someone in authority, someone who was supposed to be an educator, slowly chipping away at her confidence. That evening, as Lily worked on her homework, she found herself staring at her biology textbook for long minutes without really seeing it. Her mom noticed her unusual quiet during dinner. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" she asked, setting down her fork. Lily considered telling her everything, the quiz, the lab incident, the constant subtle jabs. But she remembered how hard her mom had fought for her over the years, how exhausting it must have been to constantly advocate for her daughter. "Just thinking about a tough assignment," she said instead, managing a smile. But that night, lying in bed, Lily made a decision. She wouldn't let Mrs. Kumar's behavior define her experience. She'd worked too hard, come too far, to let one person's prejudice push her into the background. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove that she belonged in that classroom just as much as anyone else. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the physicist in the movie Rage had mentioned. Sometimes the people who faced the biggest obstacles went on to make the biggest impact. Maybe this challenge was preparing her for something important too. Little did she know, the next day would bring a turning point that would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire school community. The morning of the big cell development lab started like any other, but there was an electricity in the air that made everyone's hair stand on end. Students filed into the biology classroom, their excited chatter filling the room as they spotted the elaborate lab setup on each table. Microscopes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by perfectly arranged slides, pipettes, and staining solutions. Lily wheeled in right on time, her heart beating faster at the sight of all the equipment. She'd stayed up late studying the lab manual, determined to be prepared. Her mom had even helped her practice the hand movements required for handling the delicate slides, using a set of plastic ones they'd bought from the teaching supply store. "This is a complex procedure," Mrs. Kumar announced, her voice cutting through the classroom buzz. "We'll be observing cell division in real time. One wrong move could contaminate the samples." Her gaze swept the room before landing, as it so often did on Lily. "Some of us might find this too challenging." The emphasis on that last word made Lily's stomach twist, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned that showing weakness only made things worse. Please move to your assigned lab stations, Mrs. Kumar continued, reading names from her clipboard. Chen and Patel Table 1. Rodriguez and Singh Table 2. The list went on, but Lily's name remained unspoken. When all other students were settled at their stations, Lily raised her hand. Mrs. Kumar, which table should I go to? The teacher's lips pressed into a thin line. Oh, I thought I made it clear last time. You'll observe from the back. We can't risk any accidents with the equipment. A murmur rippled through the classroom. Priya, already seated at her station, half rose from her stool. Mrs. Kumar, Lily can share our. That won't be necessary, Mrs. Kumar cut her off sharply. This is a liability issue. Now, everyone open your lab manuals to page 47. Lily felt her cheeks burn as she wheeled to the back corner, far from any of the lab tables. She could barely see the microscope demonstrations from here, and the whiteboard was partially blocked by a tall storage cabinet. Her carefully prepared lab notes sat useless in her folder. The class proceeded with Mrs. Kumar explaining each step of the procedure. Students began preparing their slides, their faces showing intense concentration as they carefully transferred samples and adjusted their microscopes. The room filled with the kind of productive energy that usually made Lily love science, the shared excitement of discovery, the satisfaction of seeing theory come to life under the lens. But today, she felt like a ghost in her own classroom, watching life happen around her without being able to participate. Her hands, which had practiced these very movements at home, lay still in her lap. Mrs. Kumar? Lily spoke up during a quiet moment, her voice steadier than she felt. I've studied all the procedures, and I'm confident I can handle the equipment safely. Could I please try? Absolutely not. Mrs. Kumar's response cracked like a whip. This is exactly the kind of disruption I was trying to avoid. You're already getting credit just for being here. What more do you want? The room fell silent. Even the usual background sounds, the scrape of stools, the click of microscope adjustments, seemed to freeze in the wake of those words. Lily felt something shift inside her, like a dam breaking. All the small hurts, the subtle dismissals, the careful silence she'd maintained, they came rushing out in a single clear response. I want to learn, just like everyone else. Mrs. Kumar turned slowly, her face flushing. Learn? You want to learn? Her voice rose with each word. Do you have any idea how much extra work you create? How much time we waste accommodating your condition? This is a science class, not a special education center. The word freak didn't need to be said aloud this time. It was written in every line of Mrs. Kumar's face, in the contempt dripping from each syllable. Someone gasped. A microscope slide shattered on the floor. Raj stood up so quickly his stool toppled backward with a crash, but Lily didn't hear any of it. Blood rushed in her ears as she wheeled herself toward the door, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She couldn't let them see her cry. Not here. Not now. The hallway seemed endless as she pushed herself forward, not sure where she was going. Behind her, she could hear raised voices. Maybe someone calling her name, but she kept moving. Her arms worked automatically, muscle memory taking her through familiar turns until she found herself in the library's quiet study area. Here, surrounded by tall shelves and the comforting smell of books, Lily finally let the tears fall. They weren't just tears of humiliation or hurt, they were tears of anger too. Anger at the injustice, at the casual cruelty, at the way people could look at her wheelchair and see only what she couldn't do, never what she could. She thought about her mom, who had always taught her to stand up for herself, even if standing was metaphorical. She thought about Maya, who never once treated her differently. She thought about Raj and Priya, who had tried to help despite their own fear of speaking up. Through her tears, Lily pulled out her phone and began typing. She wasn't sure if it would be a complaint, a story, or just a record of what happened, but she knew she had to get the words out. They'd flowed from her fingers like a river breaking through ice, carrying all the things she'd wanted to say but couldn't. She was so focused on her writing that she didn't notice someone had entered the library until a gentle voice spoke. Hey, are you okay? Lily looked up to find Aisha, a girl she knew from the school newspaper, standing there with genuine concern in her eyes. And in that moment, as Lily met Aisha's gaze, she realized something important. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who might come after her, every person who might face the same prejudice and silence. Sometimes the breaking point isn't really an ending, it's a beginning. Aisha didn't just ask if Lily was okay, she pulled up a chair and stayed. The library's quiet corner became a sanctuary as afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting warm patterns on the carpet. For a long moment, neither girl spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like a breath, a pause between what had happened and what would happen next. "I saw everything," Aisha said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "And I recorded it on my phone." She pulled out her smartphone, showing Lily a video that captured the entire confrontation in Mrs. Kumar's classroom. The sound was clear, every harsh word preserved with perfect clarity. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she watched the scene play out from an outside perspective. It looked even worse than it had felt in the moment. Mrs. Kumar's face twisted with contempt, the shocked expressions of her classmates, her own dignified response before wheeling away. "Why did you record it?" Lily asked, genuinely curious. She knew Aisha as the star of the debate team, always carrying a notebook and asking tough questions at school board meetings, but they'd never really talked before. Aisha's dark eyes were serious as she tucked her phone away. "Because I've been watching this happen for weeks. The way she treats you, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. And sometimes you need evidence to make people listen." A rush of emotions swept through Lily, relief at being believed, fear of what might happen next, and something else. "Hope, Mandy?" "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I don't want to cause trouble." "Standing up for yourself isn't causing trouble," Aisha said firmly. She pulled out her notebook, the one she was famous for carrying everywhere, and flipped it open. "Look at this. I've been keeping track of everything I've seen in that class." Pages of careful notes filled the notebook. Dates, times, specific comments, instances of Mrs. Kumar denying accommodations. Aisha had even noted which students were present during each incident. It was like reading a police report of her own humiliation, but somehow seeing it documented made it feel more real and more clearly wrong. "Why would you do all this for me?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We barely know each other." Aisha was quiet for a moment, fiddling with her pen. "My little brother has dyslexia," she said finally. "Last year, at his old school, a teacher made him read aloud in class every day, even though he had an accommodation not to. He was so anxious he started getting sick before school. My parents had to fight for months to get anyone to listen." Her eyes met Lily's. Nobody should have to go through that alone. Just then, Maya burst into the library, slightly out of breath. "Lily, I've been looking everywhere." She rushed over, then noticed Aisha and slowed down. Hi, is everything okay?" "Actually," Lily said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice, "I think it might be. Aisha's been gathering evidence about Mrs. Kumar." Maya's eyes widened as Aisha showed her the video and the notebook. "This is perfect. I mean, not perfect that it happened, but perfect that we have proof." She sat down with them, her usual energy focused into determination. "What's our next step?" "First," Aisha said, pulling out a fresh page in her notebook, "we need to get Lily's side of the story. Everything that's happened from the beginning. Then we can think about who to talk to, the principal, the school board, maybe even the disability rights office at the education department." For the next hour, the three girls worked together in their quiet corner of the library. Lily found herself telling things she hadn't even told her mom, the small daily humiliations, the way Mrs. Kumar would sometimes mutter under her breath, the constant feeling of being seen as a problem to be dealt with rather than a student to be taught. Aisha wrote everything down in her neat handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Maya added her own observations from the times she picked Lily up after class or heard stories from other students. Together, they built a timeline that showed a clear pattern of discrimination. "You know what else we need?" Aisha said, looking up from her notes. "Statements from other students. I know Rage and Pryor would help. They've been really upset about what's happening." But would anyone actually speak up? Lily worried her bottom lip. It's scary to go against a teacher. Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone, Maya pointed out. Like how those kids in history class last year all came forward about the unfair grading once the first person spoke up. As if on cue, Rage and Pryor appeared around the corner of the bookshelf. "We've been looking for you," Pryor said softly. "What happened in class? It wasn't right. We want to help, Raj added firmly. Just tell us what you need. Lily felt tears pricking at her eyes again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. These were tears of gratitude, of realizing she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Aisha immediately shifted into action mode, explaining their documentation project and asking if Raj and Priyo would be willing to write down their observations. Both agreed without hesitation, pulling up chairs to join their growing circle. As the afternoon light began to fade, Lily looked around at the small group gathered in their library corner. Maya, her longtime friend who'd always had her back. Aisha, who'd been quietly fighting for justice before Lily even knew she needed an ally. Raj and Priya, whose quiet support had suddenly become vocal and determined. Thank you, she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. Don't thank us yet, Aisha replied with a determined smile. This is just the beginning. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else in this school. As they'd packed up their notes and prepared to head home, Lily felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Power. Not the kind that comes from authority or intimidation, but the kind that grows from solidarity, from knowing you're standing up for what's right. Same time tomorrow? Aisha asked, shouldering her backpack. We can start working on formal complaints and gathering more statements. Lily nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. And maybe we could start something bigger. A student advocacy group or something. So nobody has to collect evidence alone like you did. I love it, Maya exclaimed. We could call it. Let's figure out the name tomorrow, Aisha laughed. One battle at a time. As Lily wheeled herself toward the exit, she realized that this wasn't just about confronting Mrs. Kumar anymore. It was about changing the whole system, about making sure every student knew they deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead us to the best people and to discovering strength we never knew we had. Word spread through Riverside high like ripples in a pond. What started as a small group meeting in the library corner grew into something bigger than anyone had expected. By the end of the week, students from different grades and social circles were finding their way to what they now called the study group, though studying was only part of what happened there. I can't believe how many people showed up today, Maya whispered to Lily as they watched more students pull up chairs and settle on the floor of their now crowded library corner. Some faces were familiar, others weren't, but they all shared the same determined expression. Aisha stood at the center, her trusty notebook in hand, somehow managing to look both professional and approachable in her favorite purple sweater. Okay, everyone, she began, her voice carrying that natural leadership quality that had made her such a successful debate team captain. Today we're going to organize all the evidence we've collected. The evidence had grown far beyond Aisha's initial observations. Students from current and past classes had come forward with their own stories about Mrs. Kumar's behavior. But more than that, they'd started sharing other concerns about fairness and accessibility in the school. Remember when they scheduled the talent show in the old auditorium that doesn't have a ramp? A sophomore named Danny spoke up. My brother couldn't participate because he uses a walker. Heads nodded around the group. Aisha's pen moved quickly across the page, documenting everything. They weren't just building a case against one teacher anymore, they were creating a record of all the ways their school could do better. Priya, who had been quietly working on her laptop, raised her hand. I've been researching similar cases at other schools, she said. Did you know we have legal rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act? I made a spreadsheet comparing our situation to previous cases. That's perfect, Aisha nodded approvingly. We need to show this isn't just about one incident. It's about making sure everyone has equal access to education. Lily watched in amazement as her classmates organized themselves into teams, each focusing on different aspects of their mission. Some worked on gathering more statements, others researched school policies and disability rights laws. A group of art students even started designing posters about inclusion and accessibility awareness. During one of these sessions, a quiet freshman named Tommy approached Lily. I heard what happened in biology class, he said, fidgeting with his glasses. I wanted you to know. I have ADHD, and Mrs. Kumar makes comments about me being distracted and difficult too. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone before. Lily reached out and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to be embarrassed here," she said firmly. "We're all in this together." The study group had become more than just a place to gather evidence. It was a safe space where students could share their experiences without fear of judgment. Maya started bringing cookies, her stress baking habit coming in handy, and the atmosphere often felt more like a community gathering than a protest planning session. Even the librarian, Mrs. Chen, seemed to understand what they were doing. She quietly moved some mobile bookshelves to give them more privacy and occasionally dropped off extra chairs without comment. Once, she even left a stack of books about student activism and civil rights on a nearby table, pretending it was just regular shelf organization. One afternoon, as they were working on drafting their formal complaint, Raj's cousin Nisha visited. She was now a pre-med student at the local university, and her presence brought a new energy to the group. "When I was in high school," Nisha shared, her voice carrying the weight of experience, "I let people's doubts about my abilities hold me back. But look at me now, I'm on track to become a doctor, cerebral palsy and all. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." Her words struck a chord with everyone, especially Lily. Here was living proof that disabilities didn't define a person's potential. The group immediately invited Nisha to become their advisor, creating a bridge between high school and university activism. As their movement grew, so did their understanding of each other. They learned that Raj loved photography and started documenting their meetings through his lens. They discovered that Priya, despite her quiet demeanor, wrote powerful poetry about inclusion and acceptance. Maya revealed her talent for turning complex legal language into clear, persuasive arguments. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Lily herself. The girl who had once tried to make herself invisible in Mrs. Kumar's class now spoke with confidence about their goals. Her wheelchair, once viewed by some as a limitation, became a symbol of resilience and determination. "You know what's amazing?" Maya said one day as they were leaving another productive session. "A month ago, we were just angry and frustrated. Now we're actually changing things." She was right. Their impact was already visible in small ways. Teachers had started being more mindful about accessibility in their classrooms. Students were speaking up when they saw unfairness. The principal had even announced a review of the school's accommodation policies, though no one was sure if it was related to their growing movement. "Next week, we present our case to the school board," Aisha reminded everyone at the end of their meeting. "Remember, we're not just doing this for ourselves. We're doing it for every student who comes after us." As the group packed up their materials, sharing jokes and making plans for their next meeting, Lily couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The pain of Mrs. Kumar's actions still stung, but it had led to something powerful and unexpected, a community of students who refused to let anyone be treated as less than equal. Looking around at her friends, her allies, Lily felt a surge of gratitude. Maya, organizing their presentation materials with her usual enthusiasm. Aisha, making sure every voice was heard and documented. Raj and Priya, working together on their research. Tommy, no longer hiding his ADHD, but speaking openly about his experiences. And dozens of other students, each contributing their own strengths to their shared cause. Together, they weren't just building a case, they were building a movement. And movements, Lily was learning, had a way of creating lasting change. The school board meeting room felt impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. Large, with its high ceiling and rows of empty chairs waiting to be filled. Small, as Lily wheeled herself to the front row, surrounded by her friends and supporters, all dressed in their most professional outfits. "Remember," Aisha whispered, adjusting her blazer for the 10th time, "we have 15 minutes to present our case. We've practiced this. We're ready." Despite her confident words, her hands shook slightly as she arranged their carefully prepared documents. The room gradually filled with people. Teachers, parents, curious students, and even a reporter from the local newspaper who'd gotten wind of the story. Mrs. Kumar sat near the back, her face unreadable. Principal Richards occupied his usual seat beside the board members, looking uncomfortable. Deep breaths, Maya reminded everyone, squeezing Lily's shoulder gently. They'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, practicing their presentations, making sure every detail was perfect. Board President Mrs. Thompson called the meeting to order, her gavel echoing in the now crowded room. "First on our agenda today is a student presentation regarding," concerns about educational accessibility and discrimination. Aisha stood first, her voice clear and steady as she introduced their group. Good evening. We're here today because every student deserves respect and equal access to education. What we're about to share isn't just one person's story, it's about making our school better for everyone. As Aisha spoke, Raj quietly set up their presentation on the projector. The first slide showed a timeline of incidents in Mrs. Kumar's class, each one documented with dates, times, and witness statements. Then it was Lily's turn. She wheeled forward, her heart pounding but her voice strong. I'm here to tell you about my experience in advanced biology this semester. She shared her story without anger or self-pity, simply stating the facts, the denied accommodations, the public humiliation, the systematic exclusion from lab activities. The video Aisha had recorded played next. Watching Mrs. Kumar's words echo through the boardroom speakers made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Principal Richard's face grew increasingly troubled. Prina presented their research on disability rights laws and educational requirements. These aren't just suggestions, she explained, pointing to specific regulations. They're legal obligations our school must fulfill. Tommy, who'd barely spoken above a whisper when they first met him, now stood confidently before the board. This isn't just about physical disabilities, he said. It's about creating a school where everyone can learn in the way that works best for them. Maya presented statements they'd collected from other students and even some teachers who'd witnessed discrimination but hadn't known how to address it. This pattern affects our entire school community, she emphasized. When one student's rights are violated, it hurts everyone. Throughout their presentation, the board members took notes, their expressions growing more serious with each piece of evidence. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, particularly interested in their documentation of specific policy violations. But they weren't just presenting problems, they had solutions too. Aisha outlined their proposals: mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, clear procedures for reporting discrimination, regular reviews of accessibility accommodations, and the creation of a student-faculty committee to address ongoing concerns. We're not asking for special treatment, Lani concluded, her voice carrying the weight of everyone's hopes. We're asking for equal treatment, for the chance to learn, to participate, to be seen as students first, not as problems to be solved. The silence following their presentation felt electric. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat. This is extremely concerning. Principal Richards, were you aware of these issues? The principal shifted in his seat. We had received some complaints, but I hadn't realized the full extent. With all due respect, Aisha interrupted politely but firmly, we have documentation showing that multiple concerns were brought to the administration's attention. We included copies in the packets we provided. More uncomfortable shifting from the principal's direction, the board members flipped through their packets, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Kumar stood up suddenly. These students are exaggerating. They don't understand the challenges of managing a classroom. I believe the video evidence speaks for itself. Board member Dr. Chen interrupted, his voice stern. What I've seen here tonight indicates serious violations of both school policy and federal law. The other board members nodded in agreement. Mrs. Thompson turned to Principal Richards. We'll need to launch a formal investigation immediately. In the meantime, Mrs. Kumar will be placed on administrative leave pending review. A collective breath seemed to release in the room. Lily felt Maya's hand squeeze hers, saw Aisha's small smile of triumph, caught the proud looks on her other friends' faces. But they weren't finished. There's one more thing, Lily said, wheeling forward again. We'd like to propose the creation of a permanent student advocacy group, one that works with teachers and administrators to make sure every student's voice is heard and every student's rights are protected. I think, Mrs. Thompson said, looking around at her fellow board members, that's an excellent suggestion. Would your group be willing to help establish this program? Lily glanced at her friends, saw their encouraging nods. Yes, she answered. We'd be honored. As they packed up their materials after the meeting, surrounded by congratulations and supportive comments, Lily felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Mrs. Chen, the librarian who had quietly supported them all along. You know, she said softly, sometimes the most important lessons aren't taught in classrooms. You've all taught this school something valuable today. Walking out of the boardroom, their small group had grown even larger. Other students, teachers, and parents approached them, sharing their own stories, offering support, asking how they could help with the new advocacy program. "I can't believe we did it," Tommy said, his eyes shining with excitement. "No," Lily corrected him gently. "We're just getting started. Real change takes time, but now we have a chance to make it happen." As they pushed through the heavy doors into the evening air, the setting sun painted the sky in colors of hope. They had stood up for justice, and justice had listened. But more importantly, they had shown that when people stand together, even the smallest voices can create the biggest changes. Spring brought more than just new flowers to Riverside High. 3 months after the school board meeting, changes bloomed everywhere you looked. The old, narrow library doors had been replaced with automatic ones. Classrooms sported adjustable height desks. But the biggest changes weren't the physical ones. They were in the way people thought and acted. "Can you believe it's been 3 months?" Maya asked, helping Lily put up posters for their newest initiative, a peer mentoring program. The poster showed students of all abilities working together, designed by the art club under Raj's creative direction. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Lily replied, smoothing a corner of the poster. "Other times it feels like we've been doing this forever." The "this" she referred to as their student advocacy group, now officially named Bridge Builders. What had started as a response to one teacher's discrimination had grown into something much bigger. They met twice a week in their old library corner, now officially designated as the Student Advocacy Center, complete with comfortable furniture donated by local businesses who'd heard their story. Today's meeting was special. They were welcoming a group of incoming freshmen, including several students with various disabilities who'd specifically chosen Riverside High because of the changes they'd heard about. "Welcome to Bridge Builders," Lily began, addressing the nervous-looking newcomers. Her confidence in speaking to groups had grown naturally over the past months. "We're not just a club, we're a community, and every single one of you belongs here." The new students looked around the room, taking in the diverse group of faces. Tommy, now a sophomore, shared his story about living with ADHD and finding his voice. Priya presented their latest project, a database of resources and accommodation information that any student could access. "The best part," Isha explained, "is that we work directly with teachers and administrators now. When we see something that needs to change, we don't have to fight for attention. We have monthly meetings with the principal and a seat at every school board meeting." Principal Richards, who'd initially seemed defensive about their complaints, had become one of their strongest allies. After Mrs. Kumar's departure, he'd taken their suggestions seriously, implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff and creating clear procedures for reporting and addressing discrimination. The transformation wasn't just at Riverside High. Other schools in the district had started reaching out, asking for advice on starting their own advocacy programs. Lily and her friends had even been invited to speak at a regional education conference. "Remember how scared we were to speak up?" Maya whispered to Lily as they watched the new students start to open up, sharing their own hopes and concerns. "Now look at us, we're practically running a movement." Their little group had grown into a real force for change. The art club regularly collaborated with them on awareness campaigns. The school newspaper, inspired by their success, had started a regular column about accessibility and inclusion. Even the sports teams had gotten involved, organizing unified games that included students of all abilities. One particularly proud moment came when they received an email from a former student who'd graduated years ago. "I wish this had existed when I was at Riverside," she wrote. "I spent 40 years feeling invisible because of my learning disability. What you're doing matters more than you know." Today's meeting took an unexpected turn when Mr. Zhang, their new biology teacher, stopped by. Unlike Mrs. Kumar, he'd made it his mission to ensure every student could fully participate in lab work. He'd come to share some exciting news. "Remember that grant proposal we worked on together?" he asked, grinning. "We got it. Starting next semester, we'll have adaptive lab equipment that makes experiments accessible to everyone." The room erupted in cheers. It was a perfect example of how their advocacy had evolved, from fighting against discrimination to working alongside teachers to create positive changes. After the meeting, as the group was cleaning up, a small freshman girl in a wheelchair approached Lily. "Can I tell you something?" she asked shyly. "My old school, it wasn't good. The other kids, some teachers, they made me feel like I didn't belong. But today, watching you lead the meeting, I thought, maybe I can do that too someday." Lily smiled, remembering how she'd felt just months ago in Mrs. Kuma's class. "You can do that and more," she said, "and you won't have to do it alone." Later that afternoon, the core group, Lily, Maya, Aisha, Raj, Puranga, and Tommy, gathered in their favorite spot behind the library. The spring sun was warm, and someone had brought cookies. Maya's stress baking had evolved into celebration baking. "You know what's really amazing?" Raj said, scrolling through photos on his camera. "Look at these." He showed them pictures from their first meetings, a small, nervous group huddled in the library corner, compared to today's packed session full of confident, engaged students. "We did that," Aisha said proudly, but then corrected herself. "No, we're still doing it. Every day." "And it's not just about disabilities anymore," Priya added. "We're helping create a school where everyone feels valued, where differences are seen as strengths." As if to prove her point, they could see through the window as students gathered in the courtyard. The chess club teaching moves to anyone interested, the drama club rehearsing with signing interpreters for their upcoming play, athletes and non-athletes chatting together at the new accessible picnic tables. "I got an A on my biology midterm," Lily shared suddenly. "Not because anyone gave me special treatment, but because Mr. Jung made sure I could actually do all the labs and learn the material." "That's what real inclusion looks like," Maya said, giving her friend a side hug. "Equal opportunity to succeed, or fail, on your own merits." As they packed up to head home, Lily paused to look around the school that had changed so much, and the friends who had helped make that change happen. The painful memory of Mrs. Kuma's words had faded, replaced by countless moments of triumph, large and small. "Hey," Tommy called out, already halfway down the hall. "Don't forget, committee meeting tomorrow. We're finalizing plans for the Inclusive Spirit Week." Lily smiled, wheeling after her friends. They'd started this journey fighting against discrimination, but they'd ended up creating something much more powerful, a community where everyone could belong, learn, and thrive. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes when you stand up for yourself, you end up standing up for everyone.